I want to talk about what might seem to be one of the most random topics to date that I've talked about on this channel, Holy and Healthy. We're going to talk about it anyway, and that topic is bread. Yes, bread. Now, bread is one of the oldest, might you say, prepared foods in human, in the whole time that humans have been here on the earth. It's a food that's typically made when you get grains, whether it be wheat or barley or, something like that, rye. You grind them up and then you might combine them with flour, oil, leaven, yeast or whatever, and then expose it to heat, bake it. And then you have bread. A lot of us love bread. Can I get a witness? We love bread. Now, bread has been very, very important for millennia simply due to the fact that it is a very, very high energy food. Now, when you look in the Bible, you see bread show up a whole lot, Old Testament and New Testament. So you think about, for example, and I'm not by any means going to exhaust the various examples of bread in the Bible, but what I think about is, like, for example, when the people of Israel were about to leave Egypt, to be free, what did they do? They prepared bread for the journey. They did unleavened bread because they didn't have time to, let the bread rise, if they put yeast and that kind of thing in it. So they made unleavened bread. Okay. And even when they were in the wilderness, they were sustained by bread from heaven, AKA manna. And then you have various other examples where people are, preparing bread, or you have the example where the prophet, I always forget whether it's Elijah or Elisha, but where the lady reached out to the prophet because she didn't have enough money to, sustain her and her son. And so she had a little bit of, I think, flour, a little bit of oil, and she was going to bake one more cake, so that her and her son could eat it and then die, because basically she had nothing left. But again, that was important. That was like the thing that she had because they lived off of bread, and then you have, just like even the fact that the scripture that says man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. That's a scripture that Jesus quoted when he was in the wilderness, because the enemy, Satan, tempted him to turn stones into bread. Why? Because he was fasting, and bread is this very, very high energy, sustaining, and delicious food that would help him to keep on going while he was on his fast in the wilderness. So bread is a very, very important food. It has been for a really, really long time. Very important for sustaining, because it's so high energy. Now, the reason why I'm talking about it in this video is a couple of different reasons. One, bread is important. However, one thing that distinguishes us from people in the Bible or people in ancient times is the fact that these people were on their feet a lot of times. They were way more active than you and I are, in general. You're talking about, you had to go on a journey, and you probably need to take some loaves of bread, and so you had to, so that you could sustain yourself, because you're going to walk. The average person wasn't even going to have probably like a donkey or a horse or anything like that to travel with. So you needed bread to help you to keep on going on your trip. Who these days would take a trip where they're walking for a day or several days? Nobody does, unless maybe you live in a country that doesn't have like transportation like we do and vehicles like we do here in America. But my point remains, we don't move we're not nearly as active as they used to be. However, bread is still a very, 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 very much widely and excessively consumed food in our society. So what happens with that? what happens is that we tend to get overweight because we put so much emphasis on bread. Now, if you recall, like me growing up, I'm a millennial, and I recall when the food pyramid that they made from the USDA, I think it was, is what it is, the USDA food pyramid, the food that they had that we should consume the most of was grains and breads and stuff, 6 to 11 servings. But again, while that that may not have been as much of a concern or an issue at all, if we were very, very active, actually needing the energy, here now, the average American is not nearly active enough in the general sense, let alone active enough to eat multiple servings of bread, 6 to 11 servings of bread a day. And so here we are in our society where almost 3/4, if not probably by now, 3/4 of our population are overweight. And I believe one of the big reasons for that is because we put such an emphasis on bread. Just think about it. If you really think about the way that we eat here in America, bread is always going to be a part of it. It's always going to be a part of our meal. It's always, bread or some sort of grain, pasta, something like that. It's always going to be not just a part of our meal, but it's going to be a big part of our meal. But we tend to be imbalanced because we eat so many grains, but yet we tend to be so inactive. Okay. Now, the other reason why I wanted to mention bread is this: the bread that we read about, that they ate in the Bible, is very different than the bread you and I buy from the grocery store. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, bread that people were eating, in the Bible days, and I'm not just going to say in the Bible days, because it's just even just bread that people make in their homes, whether it be all the way back then or typically, I say, well, probably for the most part, even here now, is going to be very simple. Flour, maybe a little salt, maybe some water, maybe some oil, maybe some yeast, and there is your bread. However, if you've never looked at the back of a sliced bread bag, look at it and see all of the ingredients that are in there. So first of all, you're not going to have just plain flour. You're going to have what they call enriched flour, which is flour that they've added stuff to because the flour was so stripped of nutrients and all this kind of stuff that they had to try to add some nutrients back synthetically. And then you have various other fillers, and sugar and, just various other chemicals that just were not in the bread back then. So the bread that we read about in the Bible, or the bread that somebody would make in their home in today's world, is not the bread that we're eating now. So that's why I want to say this. Bread is an important food. We see, based on how much is mentioned in the Bible, it was very important. But in this day and age, unless you're making your own bread, and then also you're very, very active, we probably don't need to be eating bread all the time. Simply because of the fact that it is a very, very high energy food, and most of us are not moving nearly enough to eat bread 3 meals a day. Or, and keep in mind, it's not just like, getting a slice of bread with your dinner or eating a breakfast sandwich. It's also going to the convenience store and getting a honey bun, or, getting some donuts, whenever they bring them to your office. And those are even kind of like bad for other reasons, because it's like even more chemicals and a lot of sugar and whatnot. So I'm just saying all that to say bread was and is an important food. However, for those of us in this day and age, we might want to really think about how much bread we're eating. Okay, especially if this bread is bread that you bought from the grocery store, because for the most part, the breads on the shelves at the grocery store are trash for the most part. And if you don't believe me, go and look at the ingredients. If because typically what's going to happen, I'm going to end on this. You're going to see bread has a paragraph of ingredients, most of which you probably have a hard time pronouncing. Okay. Let me know. This video may have seemed totally random, but it's just something that came into my mind to really talk and think about. But I want to know what you think about bread. How much do you eat bread, and do you agree with me as far as like what I've been talking about as far as like bread's importance in biblical times versus in this day and age? Let me know what you think in the comments. And I do appreciate you watching. Make sure you watch the other video that you see on the screen as well.